It's very good to see everybody here this morning. We've got several of our members back from recent vacation, and it is very nice to have you today. We do pray, of course, for all of our visitors, and we encourage you to continue to participate with us in our worship by having your Bibles open, by having your hearts open as well to some of the things that we're going to be talking about today. As a preacher, sometimes you just have a few thoughts that you'd like to share with a congregation that might not make up a full 25 to 30 minute lesson. And that's what happened to me for over the last few weeks. I have had some things I want to talk about on the subject of marriage, and they're somewhat disparate ideas, and I've had a hard time figuring out how to put them into one sermon. So instead of worrying about it, I just decided to do a lesson on marriage potpourri. Potpourri, of course, being the delightfully scented flower petals and dried fruit that you find in people's homes. Potpourri also being a subject in Jeopardy. When the editors of Jeopardy have a bunch of clues they want to put together, and they don't have a single theme, they just throw it into the potpourri category. So I would like to look at some things this morning on marriage. Each of these ideas might take 5 to 10 minutes. They're important ideas, I believe, important questions that need to be answered that don't necessarily make up one cohesive lesson. But the question I want to ask, first of all, is this: is marriage becoming obsolete? The Pew Research Center, sponsored by Time Magazine, conducted a study. This is back in 2010, but I believe it's still applicable today. They found that 39% of Americans believed that marriage was becoming obsolete. And that's a significant jump from only 28% back in 1978. Further, 29% of children now live with a parent or parents who are unmarried, which is a 5-fold increase from 1960. 15% of children have parents who are divorced or separated from each other. And while this might seem like kind of a discouraging trend, one glimmer of hope can be found in the statistic that 67% of Americans still feel somewhat upbeat about marriage as an institution. In 2013, the Pew Research Center found that 61% of people who had never been married still wanted to get married. And again, these might just represent a glimmer of hope when it comes to marriage in our society, but I think we'll take it. Furthermore, there is this issue that comes up frequently when you're talking about marriage in American culture, and the issue is that 50% of marriages end in divorce. And some people might even continue to believe the false statistic that 50% of people are divorced. And we'll talk about that here in a moment. So I wonder if that's true, that 50% of marriages end in divorce. According to Shanti Feldon, who is a social researcher and author of the book, The Good News About Marriage, she said this oft-cited divorce rate isn't anywhere near accurate. Yet we continue to hear it, don't we? We hear it on the news, and we hear it from friends, and we read it in the newspaper, and we see it thrown around on social media frequently, that 50% of marriages end in divorce. Interestingly enough, when you actually look at Census Bureau statistics, it says that 72% of people are still married to their first spouse. So I find it kind of interesting. How can it be a 50% divorce rate when 72% of Americans who are married are still married to their first spouse? And of the other 28% who are no longer married to their first spouse, a good chunk of that are widowed, which means that the actual number of divorcees in the United States is somewhere quite a bit less than 28% of our country. And actually, the overall divorce rate is getting lower to the tune of 32% lower since 1980. And not surprisingly, the divorce rate among practicing Christians, practicing being different than nominal Christians or those who simply identify as Christians statistically, but among practicing Christians, of people who actually regularly attend worship with a congregation, the divorce rate is 27% lower than the rest of the American population. And I suspect that has to do with being surrounded by a community of like-minded people who keep us honest about our marriages and accountable. As to the idea of marriage being obsolete, I think we just need to ask the right kind of question. Is it that marriage is becoming obsolete, or is it that certain kinds of marriages are becoming obsolete in our culture? And what I mean by that is that if we see marriage simply as an institution that keeps people subjugated, which certainly in times past marriage was used as an institution to keep women subjugated, or if we believe that marriage is simply something that facilitates business arrangements or political partnerships, and certainly in some cultures even today and in many cultures in the past, marriage was all about business arrangements and political partnerships, then perhaps those kinds of marriages are obsolete in 21st century American culture. The idea of subjugating women and the idea of building business partnerships and political arrangements, yes, those kinds of marriages, I don't believe, have as much, if any place at all, in our culture today. We've become, I think, more sensitive to human rights, and rightly so. We've become more attuned to access to leisure time and education, and again, rightly so. And effectively, equal economic opportunities for men and women have made some marriages from the past, certain kinds of marriages, obsolete. Women today are not getting married because they need to survive, but because they choose to. Men are not getting married in order to secure some bright economic or social future. Either men are getting married because they want to. In many ways, and I believe that this is a positive trend in our culture, because I am the eternal optimist, I think in many ways marriage has been stripped down to its most essential and really most biblical functions in a lot of marriages today. Establishing and recognizing a lifelong commitment between one man and one woman and building a family within that framework. And we're not as concerned today, I think rightly so, over other conditions and reasons to be married. We have to remember that marriage wasn't invented yesterday. Marriage wasn't invented yesterday. And things that have existed since the beginning of man's existence, practically speaking, don't just go obsolete. Things that have existed over many generations, from time to time, from people to people, from civilization to civilization, do not become obsolete. They certainly don't become obsolete overnight, but I believe they don't ever become obsolete, because has humanity really changed in the last several thousand years? Have our needs really changed since Adam and Eve? Our need for commitment, our need for relationship, our need for community, our need for romance, have those things really changed since Adam and Eve? Of course they haven't. So when we talk about marriage becoming obsolete, I think we're really talking about the wrong thing. From the beginning, the Bible says, God made them male and female, which means that marriage is as old as humanity itself. Things that work well for thousands of years don't just become obsolete. And there's certainly something to be said for time-tested institutions such as marriage. And to me, it feels like nothing more than cultural arrogance to say that we have new or better ways of defining and practicing humanity's most intimate, most sacred, and most essential of all relationships. Now, maybe some people are convinced that marriage is obsolete because it might not work anymore, because they see that marriages are failing in the lives of their friends and their family members, or maybe they have been exposed in their own household as children of divorcees. Maybe they've been exposed in their own household to the destructive influence and consequences of divorce. And even in pop culture, we see this theme played out. Marital failure is a common theme in almost any activity, in almost any of our favorite shows and movies and forms of entertainment. We need to be careful, though, that when we're talking about marriage, we're talking about marriage as God defines it, not the way that culture defines it. We need to be careful to take a long, hard look at God's intention for marriage before we give up on it. Because maybe the problem with marriage today is not that marriage itself is failing, but we're just becoming bad at it. So why is marriage failing? Or why at least is this idea perpetuated so much? For no other reason that we perhaps have strayed far from the ideal in marriage. Consider what you find in marriage in the Bible. And it's very interesting, isn't it, that when we talk about marriage, one of the things that people today who believe marriage is obsolete or marriage is failing or marriage is falling apart, one of the things that they complain about is that we can't just take these old ideas, these age-old ideas, and apply them to our conditions today. God has no idea what it's like to live in the 21st century. The Bible has no idea how to be applied in the 21st century. These are ideas that are just obsolete. They're archaic. They're old-fashioned. I wonder, what's old-fashioned about this? In Deuteronomy 24 and verse 5, it talks about the way that a man, when he is married to a woman, is to be free from military service for a time. And what is the reason that God gives in Deuteronomy 24 verse 5? What is the because in that statement? It's so that he can give happiness to his wife. That's the reason, to give happiness to his wife. I wonder, have we become so advanced in the 21st century that we're no longer needing to give happiness to a spouse? Is that what's obsolete about God's definition of marriage? How about in Ecclesiastes 9, verse 9, the idea of a man living joyfully with his wife all the days of his fleeting life? Is that the part of God's definition of marriage that's obsolete today? I wonder, in Proverbs 5 and verse 19, a man being intoxicated with the love of his wife, is that what's obsolete today? How about it in Proverbs 5 and verse 18, the man rejoicing in the relationship with his wife? How about in Ephesians 5 verse 25, and a willingness to sacrifice his life for his bride? Is that kind of unselfishness obsolete? Ephesians 5 and verse 29, nourishing and cherishing her as if his wife was his own flesh. 1 Peter 3 and verse 7, that a man becomes an expert on his wife and knows his wife and treats her as if he really does know her and her needs. Is that obsolete? Genesis 2 and verse 18, a woman who supports her husband, who is a helper to all things that they share together. I wonder, is that obsolete? Proverbs 31 and verse 12, a woman who does good for her husband all his life. Do we no longer need to be good for each other in our relationships and to support each other? In Ephesians 5 verse 33, a woman respects her husband. Do we no longer need respect in our relationships? Titus chapter 2 verses 3 and 4, that older women teach younger women the value of loving their husbands. Or in Ephesians 5 and verse 31, that the husband and wife are so close that they might as well be one flesh together. Like I said earlier, maybe it's not that marriage is becoming obsolete. Maybe it's just that we have some bad ideas about marriage that are obsolete. And if we just go back to the original design of what God wants for our marriages, we will discover that it is a time-tested and timeless relationship. Now, the second question that I often hear about marriage is this. And this is what I mean by these are completely disparate ideas. I just didn't have a full 25 or 30-minute sermon to talk about each of these ideas. But the next question I often hear from people is, how do I go about test driving a marriage or test driving a relationship before it becomes a marriage? Because one possible reason why the divorce rate is increasing, and this is kind of a good news, bad news kind of thing here when it comes to our culture. One of the possible reasons why our divorce rate is actually declining from generation to generation is that from generation to generation, more and more people are choosing to live together before they're married. And it makes sense from a pragmatic, worldly perspective that if you test drive a relationship and see what it's like to live with a person and their eccentricities and their bad habits, that it makes it easier to decide to commit to that person for a life in marriage. Now again, that's a good news, bad news thing, isn't it? I don't know any Christian who would lament the fact that divorce rates are lower among younger people. That as you get from older to younger, the divorce rate actually decreases from generation to generation. I don't know anybody who would lament the fact that our divorce rate nationally is somewhere well below 28% and that people are actually staying married, contrary to the common misconception. The bad news, of course, is that one of the reasons why people are staying married and not getting divorced is because they've been shacking up for 2 or 3 years before their wedding day. And many people see living together as kind of a first major step in a serious relationship, that it's kind of a pre-marriage trial period of sorts. Consider, more statistics coming at you. I hope you're writing all of these things down. From 1965 to 1974, only 11% of women cohabited with a man before they were married, compared with 66% of women cohabiting with a man by 2005 and 2006. That is a six-fold increase, my friends, statistically, of women who choose to live with a man before marrying him. Plainly put, though, and let's see what the Bible has to say about this. Plainly put, fornication is a sin. I think that's one thing that maybe as a culture we've brushed under the rug and has become so popular again in our culture and our media and in our favorite TV shows and movies, to just see fornication as the standard. That everybody's going to fornicate at some point. It is how we all are. It's what we're all going to do. And yet, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 9, in a list of sins that would keep a person out of the kingdom of God, fornication is the very first thing on the list. Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4 says that adulterers and fornicators God will judge, and that is in direct contrast to the holiness that is supposed to be found in the marriage bed. Sexual immorality and sensual activities are listed among the deeds of the flesh in Galatians 5 and verse 19. And our sexual appetites can only be fulfilled in holiness within marriage. That, of course, is 1 Corinthians chapter 7, beginning in verse 1, that because of immoralities, let each man have his own wife, and each woman have her own husband. So we need to be really careful in our culture, and as our culture creeps into the church as well, in our thinking and our mentality, we need to be really careful not to try and answer a bad problem with an equally bad solution. Well, how do I know if he's the right man for me? How do I know if I can love her for my whole life? How do we know that we're compatible with each other? I know. Instead of getting married with all of these question marks and probably getting divorced in 7 years, let's just live together for a few years and then we'll know if we should be married. Again, you're trying to fix a bad potential problem with an equally bad solution. Isn't there another alternative, though? Isn't there another way that we can figure these things out? Aren't there other ways of getting to know people that doesn't include sin? Well, I certainly think that there are. I certainly think that there are. Is it possible to get to know somebody well enough before marriage, without living together, without fornicating, to know that you're compatible with each other? I suppose you could ask anybody in this congregation who's been married for 60 years if it's possible, and you might just get your answer. How do I go about testing a relationship then without really knowing a person like that? How do I know that I'm actually compatible with a person? Here are 3 things that I want you to consider then. First of all, the notion that I can only know if I'm compatible with somebody if I have sex is a completely ridiculous notion. The sexual relationship changes throughout your lifetime, and anybody who's been married longer than 6 months knows that this is absolutely true. Your sexual relationship goes through a lot of different phases as you get older, as your spouse gets older, as your bodies change, and as your relationship changes. So the irony, the funny thing to me is that how you have sex with each other before married as 19-year-old kids is nothing like how you're going to have sex with each other 20 years later. Well, how do we know we'll still be compatible then? Well, that's the great thing about the sexual relationship in a marriage, is that as you change together. And as you go through different phases of your life and different phases of your relationship, the really beautiful thing is that you get to discover each other and you get to discover that part of your life together. So this notion that I can only know if I'm compatible if I have sex with a person before marriage, it's completely shot to death by this idea that sex changes as you go through life. Second, there's very little that we can learn about each other while cohabiting that I don't think you can observe while not cohabiting. There's a lot that you can see about a person in other areas of their life that give you more than enough hints, clues, and great big red flags without having to live with a person. How a person lives alone says a lot about how they'll live while married. How did he or she live with his or her parents? Is he or she naturally clean, studious, organized, punctual? You can see all of those things without being married to a person. And what will two people discover about each other while cohabiting that is so earth-shattering, so mind-blowing, so relationship-altering that can't be learned after marriage? Are you seriously telling me that if you don't live with a person and discover that he doesn't rinse his toothbrush out after he brushes his teeth, that if you discover that after you're married, you'll divorce him over that? You're telling me that if you don't find out that he prefers the right side of the bed over the left side of the bed, and you find out after you're married, you're going to divorce him over that. If you find out that your spouse doesn't like to recycle, are you seriously telling me that if you find that out after you're married, you're going to go, that would have been a deal breaker from day one? And if we'd only lived together, I would have known that you hate planet Earth, and I wouldn't have ever married you from the start. Really, I mean, what kinds of things do you discover in 2 or 3 years of living together that would destroy a marriage after finding out about it later? To me, I just think if that's the reason why you're living together, you're being petty. You're being petty and you're being small. And if you're going to divorce a person over strange foibles and habits and eccentricities, then you are being even more small. How shallow do you think your relationship is, that it would be worth sinning and risking your eternal soul just to live with a person and make sure there are no deal breakers like that? And third, long dating or courtship relationships can actually be wonderful. Because in the course of several years of dating, I find it hard to believe that there's really so much more to learn about a person that can only be learned while living together. And perhaps all of this living together is just a symptom of our culture's larger problem of impatience. We're always so eager to move on to the next phase, we can't slow down and appreciate what it's like to be in the here and now. If you do end up marrying the person you're dating, you will never be in a dating relationship with that person ever again. If you get engaged, you do realize that barring some kind of catastrophe, you will never be an engaged couple ever again. You will never have a fiancé ever again. You'll never plan another wedding for the rest of your life. Why not enjoy that phase for what it is, instead of always rushing to get to the next phase and play marriage with a person that God says you're not married to yet? And the third question I have is this: is my spouse my soulmate? I cannot tell you how many times I've done premarital counseling with young couples who have asked this exact question. How do I know if he's my soulmate? How do I know if he's the one? And maybe you've said something like that at some point also in your own relationships. I just want to know, is he the one? Is this a biblical idea, though? I want to first, in a very unromantic and very sad way, dispel this notion that we are being cosmically directed to find our one and only soulmate in the search for our spouse. This is a romantic notion, and it is perpetuated by pop culture, and it is one that is happily accepted by people in our culture. But it's insubstantial drivel. Insubstantial drivel. Of course, you might interject, well, that doesn't sound very loving of you, Ryan. Are you saying that Rebecca's not your soulmate? That she's not the one? Well, I've never said that about her, but I think she wonders sometimes about me. She easily could have done better. But to that notion, I would respond that marriage is a relationship that's meant to be temporary. Relationship that is meant to be temporary. You do realize that you get to be married, again, if you're fortunate, barring some kind of catastrophe, you get to be married for, at the best, 50 years, 60, 65, maybe among the very few of us who will live together that long. And you will spend the rest of eternity with God if you've lived faithful for Him. And Jesus Himself said in Matthew chapter 22 and verse 30 that in the afterlife, in the resurrection, we're neither married nor given in marriage. We are not going to be married. In the resurrection, I'm not going to be a male. She's not going to be a female. Because in the resurrection, we will not have physical bodies. Physical bodies that are defined in the way that we define them now in this life. Rebecca is not going to be my wife in the resurrection. And I will not be her husband in the resurrection. Our marriage is temporary. It is temporary. If anything, and here's the consolation, and I believe it's a pretty big consolation, by the way. If anything, Rebecca and I will know each other better in the resurrection than we do now. Because in the resurrection, all of the physical shackles will have been removed, and she and I will see each other as glorified souls rather than physical bodies. And I think I want to know her that way. And you and I will know each other that way in the resurrection as well. And all saints will know each other in a deeper way than we can know each other in the flesh. But at the point of our resurrection, our marriage will be over. It is a union that is physical. It is a union that is bound to this life. With all that being said, though, we need to define marriage as God defines it. Marriage is real. It's not magical. It's not fiction. And when a marriage bond is severed, whether by an act of adultery or tragedy, we need to look upon it without such sentimentality that we refuse to let love find its way back into our lives. If you believe in soulmates and finding one and that you only have one chance in this life to be married to a person, what happens when your spouse does leave you, commit adultery, abandon you, betray you? What happens when your spouse does die younger than you two had planned in some tragedy? Rebecca and I have a love that is not unequaled in human history. We're not Romeo and Juliet. We're not some fictionalized, sensationalized, unrealistic couple from your favorite romance novel. Rebecca and I have acknowledged, both of us in our relationship, that if one or the other dies, we're okay with the other getting remarried. And I know plenty of couples, even in this congregation, people who've been widowed and remarried. Don't tell me that their love isn't real. Don't tell me that their love isn't just as powerful, as potent as their first spouse. Abraham, for example, very much mourned Sarah when she passed away. But Abraham remarried in Genesis chapter 25. And he had children with that second wife as well. And there are other verses that teach the value of remarriage after widowhood. Romans chapter 7 and verse 3, or 1 Corinthians 7 verse 39, and 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 14. And while some people might argue that remarriage might have been a necessity for people in that culture, in that time period, I think it's a mistake to assume that people in the first century couldn't love each other just as much as people in the 21st century. Don't forget that the human condition hasn't changed so much in all these years, that we don't have the same needs, the same faults, the same strengths, and the same weaknesses that we did from the very beginning. I appreciate your attention this morning. It's a little bit hard sometimes when a preacher approaches a sermon from the beginning saying, these are 3 points that have very little to do with each other. But in this great marriage potpourri, I hope you've perhaps seen some lesson for you to learn today. Anytime I preach about marriage, I preach to myself first and foremost. As a husband, I have so much to learn, so much more that I need to do better. And again, Rebecca will wholeheartedly agree with that. I hope that all of us in our marriages can see areas of improvement, constantly striving to do better, to be less selfish, more concerned, more loving, putting God first in all things and spouse second. Whatever your need is this morning, if you have a spiritual need, please let it be known by coming forward as we stand and sing.